We've all felt it at some point, that unsettling silence where certainty once lived. It creeps in during sleepless nights or unexpected moments of clarity. The suspicion that perhaps there is no grand design, no cosmic judge, no divine plan orchestrating our existence. This intuition, whispered throughout human history but rarely confronted directly, was finally given voice when Friedrich Nietzsche declared, "God is dead." These three words have echoed through modern consciousness, often misunderstood as a simple atheistic slogan or a call to nihilistic despair. But what if Nietzsche's most infamous declaration wasn't an ending at all, but an invitation to the most profound beginning? What if the death of God isn't a tragedy to mourn, but the necessary void from which genuine human freedom might finally emerge? Consider the paradox. Throughout history, humans have created gods to explain the universe, only to then surrender their own creative power to these very deities. We've authored divine narratives that, once written, were used to limit the scope of human potential. The Creator became subservient to its creation. Nietzsche recognized this circular trap, this spiritual contradiction that has haunted civilization since its inception. The death of God creates a vacuum at the center of existence, where meaning, purpose, and moral certainty once resided. Most of us sense this vacuum, even if we don't acknowledge it explicitly. We feel it in our increasing inability to find fulfillment in traditional answers, in our growing awareness that we're hurtling through space on a tiny planet with no obvious external guidance. This awareness doesn't discriminate between believers and atheists. It's a cultural condition that affects our collective consciousness regardless of individual faith. What makes Nietzsche's insight so provocative isn't merely his diagnosis of God's death, but his radical interpretation of what this death means for human possibility. While others saw cosmic orphanhood, Nietzsche glimpsed unprecedented freedom. While others mourned the loss of divine authority, he recognized the birth of human creative potential on a scale previously unimagined. Today, we're going to explore what Nietzsche really meant by "God is dead," why this death was necessary for genuine human freedom, and most importantly, what becomes possible in the void this death creates. What if losing God is the prerequisite for finding yourself? What if the absence of cosmic meaning isn't a curse but the very condition that allows you to become a creator of meaning? What if the death of God isn't the end of the sacred, but its transformation into something far more profound? Before we dive into Nietzsche's discoveries, let's observe something strange that happens whenever divine authority weakens throughout history. Humans simultaneously experience both terror and creative explosion. This pattern creates a fascinating contradiction. The death of God produces both existential anxiety and unprecedented cultural flowering. Consider what happened during the Renaissance when religious authority began to fracture. As the Church's absolute control over European thought diminished, two seemingly opposing responses emerged. On one hand, there was profound anxiety, religious wars, witch trials, apocalyptic movements, all symptoms of collective fear in the face of weakening certainty. On the other hand, there was extraordinary creativity, revolutionary art, scientific discovery, philosophical innovation, all expressions of human potential released from dogmatic constraints. This same pattern appeared in the Enlightenment, when reason began to replace revelation as the primary source of knowledge. Again, we see parallel responses: existential crisis alongside creative liberation. Philosophers like David Hume and Immanuel Kant expressed deep concern about the implications of reason's ascendance over faith, while simultaneously producing revolutionary ideas that expanded human intellectual horizons. In our own era, we can observe this contradiction intensifying. As traditional religious frameworks lose cultural authority, we witness both rising rates of anxiety, depression, and addiction, psychological symptoms of meaning crisis, alongside explosive creativity in technology, art, and social reorganization. The same force that destabilizes also liberates. The same void that terrifies also inspires. What's particularly curious is how individuals respond to this pattern. Some retreat into fundamentalism, seeking the comfort of absolute certainty even at the cost of intellectual honesty. Others embrace nihilism, concluding that without divine guarantee, nothing has meaning or value. But a small minority throughout history has responded differently, seeing in the death of God not a problem to solve, but a condition to embrace as the prerequisite for a new kind of human becoming. Another anomaly appears when we examine how different cultures handle divine absence. Eastern philosophical traditions like Buddhism and Taoism have long embraced concepts of emptiness or void as positive rather than negative states, conditions of possibility rather than lack. Western traditions, by contrast, have typically treated divine absence as a crisis requiring immediate resolution. This cultural difference suggests our terror in the face of God's death may not be a universal human response, but a particularly Western psychological pattern. Perhaps most telling is how we respond to the death of God in our personal development. Children naturally inhabit a world where external authorities provide certainty and meaning. As they mature, this certainty necessarily erodes, a psychological process mirroring the cultural process Nietzsche described. Some adults never complete this maturation, continuing to seek parent-like authorities to tell them what life means. Others complete it partially, recognizing no external authority while still yearning for one. Only a few fully mature into creators of their own meaning without resentment or nostalgia for lost certainty. This creates the central anomaly Nietzsche identified. The death of God simultaneously appears as humanity's greatest crisis and its greatest opportunity. It represents both the loss of all certainty and the birth of all possibility. It is experienced as both unbearable heaviness and unprecedented lightness. Why does this contradiction exist? And why has it been so difficult for humans to fully grasp the implications of divine absence without falling into either desperate restoration of old certainties or nihilistic despair? What might it mean to fully inhabit the void created by God's death without trying to escape it? These questions led Nietzsche to his most profound insight. The death of God isn't just a historical event or philosophical position, but a developmental challenge that both individuals and civilizations must face to reach full maturity. And like all developmental thresholds, it can be crossed successfully or unsuccessfully, depending on how it's approached. Friedrich Nietzsche was uniquely positioned to understand the implications of God's death. Born in 1844 in Prussia to a Lutheran pastor, young Friedrich was immersed in Christianity from birth. His father, grandfather, and great-grandfather had all been ministers. The Nietzsche family was steeped in Protestant tradition. When Friedrich was only 4 years old, his father died of a brain ailment, creating a void in his life that paralleled the larger cultural void he would later articulate. Imagine young Nietzsche in the late 1840s, growing up in the small village of Röcken, surrounded by his father's theological books, church symbols, and the lingering presence of paternal authority now accessible only through memory and religious devotion. This early experience of loss and absence would profoundly shape his relationship to divine authority. Despite this loss, or perhaps because of it, Nietzsche was initially deeply religious. His school peers nicknamed him the Little Pastor because of his serious demeanor and knowledge of Scripture. He could recite biblical passages from memory and seemed destined for a religious life himself. This deep immersion in Christianity gave him intimate knowledge of the very tradition he would later critique, not as an outside observer, but as someone who had inhabited its worldview completely. Nietzsche's path diverged when he entered university to study classical philology, the analysis of ancient texts. This training gave him unique tools to understand how meanings and values evolve across historical periods. He became especially interested in ancient Greek culture, which he contrasted with Christianity. The Greeks, he noted, had created gods that celebrated human potential rather than diminished it, gods that reflected human greatness rather than demanded human submission. By his early 30s, Nietzsche had become the youngest full professor at the University of Basel in Switzerland, but his academic career was cut short by debilitating health problems that would plague him for the rest of his life. Suffering from violent migraines, stomach ailments, and deteriorating vision, Nietzsche was forced to resign his position in 1879 at just 34 years old. Picture Nietzsche during this period, wandering through the Swiss and Italian Alps, seeking relief from his physical pain, living in modest boarding houses, isolated from normal social connections. This outsider position gave him a unique vantage point from which to observe European culture and its relationship to Christianity. He wasn't embedded in academic or religious institutions, but existed on their margins, neither fully inside nor completely outside. His health problems weren't incidental to his philosophy, but central to it. Constant physical suffering pushed him to question traditional religious explanations for pain. The Christian framework that interpreted suffering as divine punishment or spiritual testing seemed increasingly inadequate to explain his experience. This personal confrontation with unexplainable suffering became a microcosm for his larger questioning of divine moral order. It was during this period of isolation and physical pain that Nietzsche began to articulate what he meant by the phrase, "God is dead." This wasn't merely an atheistic claim about divine non-existence. It was a cultural diagnosis, an observation that the Christian God had ceased to function as a credible source of meaning and value in European civilization, even for many who still professed belief. Nietzsche first introduced this phrase in his 1882 work, The Gay Science, where he tells the story of a madman who runs into a marketplace announcing God's death. The madman is met with ridicule, not from religious believers, but from secular atheists who don't understand the magnitude of this event. "We have killed him, you and I," the madman declares. "But how did we do this? How could we drink up the sea? Who gave us the sponge to wipe away the entire horizon?" This passage reveals Nietzsche's unique insight. The death of God wasn't something that simply happened to humanity, but something humanity brought about through its own development. The same human capacities for reason, evidence-seeking, and ethical reflection that Christianity had helped cultivate had eventually undermined Christianity's own foundational claims. The child had outgrown the parent. Nietzsche wasn't celebrating this death in a simplistic way. He recognized its terrifying implications. Without God, all the certainties that European civilization had built upon divine authority, moral frameworks, political orders, social hierarchies, even the scientific project itself, were now floating without their traditional foundation. The death of God meant humanity had destroyed its own source of orientation without having created a replacement. But unlike many of his contemporaries who responded to this situation with despair or attempts to resurrect God in secular forms, Nietzsche saw a different possibility. What if the void left by God's death wasn't a tragedy, but the necessary clearing for something new? What if human freedom could only truly begin in this void? What if divine absence was the precondition for human self-creation? This insight positioned Nietzsche to see what others missed. The death of God isn't just a negative event, a loss or absence, but a positive opportunity for humanity to assume a new relationship to meaning, value, and its own creative potential. But before we can understand this possibility, we need to understand exactly what dies when God dies. Nietzsche's investigation began with a crucial insight that others had missed. What dies when God is dead isn't just a theological concept, but an entire system of meaning-making. In his work, Twilight of the Idols, 1888, Nietzsche wrote, "When one gives up the Christian faith, one pulls the right to Christian morality out from under one's feet. Christianity is a system, a whole view of things thought out together. By breaking one main concept out of it, the faith in God, one breaks the whole." This observation went beyond simplistic atheism. Nietzsche recognized that God functioned not just as a cosmic being, but as the guarantor of all values in Western civilization. God was the answer to why, the ultimate justification for moral claims, the foundation of purpose, the source of meaning itself. When this foundation crumbles, everything built upon it becomes unstable. Nietzsche found evidence for this comprehensive collapse in the intellectual developments of his era. The 19th century had seen unprecedented challenges to religious authority from multiple directions. Charles Darwin's theory of evolution had undermined the biblical account of creation. Historical criticism of the Bible had revealed its human origins and development. Geological discoveries had contradicted biblical timeframes. Anthropological studies had shown the cultural relativity of religious beliefs. These intellectual developments weren't just academic challenges to religious claims, but direct attacks on the source of meaning and value for Western civilization. If humans weren't created in God's image but evolved through natural selection, what happened to human dignity and purpose? If morality wasn't divinely commanded but culturally constructed, what made some values better than others? If consciousness emerged from material processes rather than divine unsoulment, what happened to spiritual significance? Most thinkers of Nietzsche's time responded to these challenges in one of two ways. Religious conservatives rejected the new knowledge to preserve traditional meaning structures. Liberal theologians tried to reconcile scientific findings with religious frameworks by reinterpreting religious claims as metaphorical rather than literal. Neither approach confronted what Nietzsche saw as the fundamental issue, not whether God exists, but what happens when God can no longer function as the foundation of meaning. Nietzsche found particularly compelling evidence for God's death in the moral debates of his era. Even as European intellectuals abandoned explicit religious beliefs, they clung to moral frameworks derived from Christianity. John Stuart Mill advocated universal human rights without acknowledging their theological origins. Karl Marx rejected religion while maintaining an essentially messianic view of history. Auguste Comte replaced God with humanity as an object of worship while preserving religious structures. These attempts to maintain Christian values without Christian foundations struck Nietzsche as profound self-deception. In On the Genealogy of Morals, 1887, he wrote, "They are far from being free spirits, for they still have faith in truth." When the Christian crusaders in the Orient encountered the invincible assassins, they also encountered that unconditional order of free spirits par excellence, for whom nothing is true and everything is permitted. Well now, that was freedom of spirit. With that, the belief in truth itself was renounced. This passage reveals what Nietzsche saw as the core issue, not just the existence of God, but the entire concept of absolute truth that God represented. When God dies, truth itself, at least as an absolute unchanging standard beyond human creation, dies with him. What remains isn't just a world without God, but a world without any fixed reference point outside human perspective. Nietzsche observed this collapse of absolute truth in his own intellectual development. In his early work as a philologist, he had discovered how meanings change across historical periods and cultural contexts. There was no fixed meaning to ancient texts, only interpretation shaped by the perspectives of different readers in different times. This insight expanded from textual interpretation to all domains of meaning. There were no moral facts, only moral interpretations. No absolute beauty, only aesthetic perspectives. No objective purpose, only subjective valuations. This recognition led Nietzsche to what he called perspectivism, the view that all knowledge is necessarily partial and positioned, that there is no God's eye view from which absolute truth could be perceived. In Beyond Good and Evil, 1886, he wrote, "There are no facts, only interpretations." This wasn't just philosophical speculation, but a direct consequence of God's death. Without a divine perspective to guarantee objective truth, all that remains are human perspectives, with no ultimate arbiter between them. Nietzsche found the most compelling evidence for God's death not in philosophical arguments, but in lived experience, particularly his own. During periods of intense physical suffering, he noticed how traditional religious explanations for pain felt increasingly hollow. The idea that suffering had divine purpose or moral meaning couldn't withstand direct confrontation with sustained, seemingly purposeless, physical agony. What emerged instead was a recognition of life's fundamental amorality, its existence beyond traditional categories of good and evil, purpose and meaninglessness. This evidence led Nietzsche to a startling conclusion. The death of God isn't just a loss of religious belief, but the collapse of the entire framework within which Western civilization had understood itself. But this collapse, while terrifying, also creates unprecedented possibility. If all meanings are human creations rather than divine revelations, then humans have the power and responsibility to create new meanings. But this creative possibility raises profound questions. If we can no longer appeal to God as the source of meaning, where does meaning come from? If there's no divine plan for human life, how do we determine what constitutes a well-lived life? And most importantly, if the death of God liberates human creative potential, why do so many respond to this death with nihilism rather than creativity? As Nietzsche's investigation deepened, He uncovered the psychological mechanisms that make confronting God's death so difficult. In The Gay Science, 1882, he observed, "God is dead, but given the way of men, there may still be caves for thousands of years in which his shadow will be shown. And we still have to vanquish his shadow too." This shadow, Nietzsche realized, persists through deep psychological structures that continue to shape human experience, even after explicit belief fades. These structures include our need for cosmic justice, our desire for absolute meaning, our longing for transcendent purpose, and our hope for immortality. The death of God doesn't automatically eliminate these psychological needs. It just removes their traditional satisfaction. Nietzsche identified several common responses to this situation. The first is what he called passive nihilism, the belief that without God, life has no meaning or value. This response accepts God's death intellectually, but cannot overcome its psychological attachment to absolute meaning. It concludes that if cosmic meaning doesn't exist, then no meaning exists at all. This perspective fails to recognize that meaning can be created rather than merely discovered. The second response is what Nietzsche termed incomplete nihilism, the attempt to replace God with secular substitutes that perform the same psychological function. These substitutes include the state, science, progress, humanity, and various political ideologies. Each offers a master narrative that promises to explain everything and provide ultimate purpose. Nietzsche saw these as essentially religious structures with different content, attempts to preserve divine authority while changing its name. In his notebooks, later published as The Will to Power, Nietzsche wrote, "What I relate is the history of the next 2 centuries. I describe what is coming, what can no longer come differently, the advent of nihilism. For some time now, our whole European culture has been moving as toward a catastrophe, with a tortured tension that is growing from decade to decade, restlessly, violently, headlong, like a river that wants to reach the end, that no longer reflects, that is afraid to reflect." This passage reveals Nietzsche's understanding of nihilism not as a philosophical position, but as a historical process unfolding across generations. The death of God creates a vacuum that cannot be immediately filled. European civilization would need to pass through a period of nihilism, a time when old values no longer command belief, but new values haven't yet been created. Nietzsche's personal experience illuminated this process. In his early 30s, after publishing The Birth of Tragedy, 1872, he experienced what biographers call his positivist phase, a period when he embraced science as a replacement for religion. He temporarily believed scientific knowledge could provide the certainty and meaning previously supplied by faith. This phase didn't last. Nietzsche soon recognized that science could explain how the world works, but not why it matters. It could provide facts, but not values. This realization led Nietzsche to his most profound insight. The death of God creates not just an intellectual problem, but an existential one. Without God, humans must confront what Nietzsche called the abyss, the recognition that existence has no inherent meaning or purpose. This confrontation produces existential vertigo, a disorientation so profound that most people will do anything to avoid it. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, 1883-1885, Nietzsche depicts this vertigo through the character of the tightrope walker who falls to his death while crossing between 2 towers. This metaphor illustrates humanity's position after God's death, suspended over an abyss without the safety net of divine meaning. Most people cannot bear this position. They either deny the abyss exists or fall into it through despair. But Nietzsche identified a third possibility, embodied in his concept of the Übermensch, often translated as Overman or Superman. This isn't a superior human, but one who has passed through nihilism to reach a new relationship with meaning. The Übermensch doesn't discover meaning but creates it, doesn't follow values but generates them, doesn't seek purpose but embodies it through creative action. This creative possibility emerges only through confronting the void left by God's death, rather than trying to fill it with substitutes. Nietzsche called this active nihilism, a transitional state where existing values are actively questioned and dismantled to create space for new value creation. Unlike passive nihilism, which merely laments the loss of meaning, Active nihilism clears the ground for new possibilities. In his personal correspondence during the 1880s, particularly letters to his friend Franz Overbeck, Nietzsche described his own passage through this process. Despite physical suffering that would have justified despair, Nietzsche experienced periods of extraordinary creativity and joy. He wrote of feeling 6,000 feet beyond good and evil, beyond traditional moral frameworks in a space of creative freedom. This experience led Nietzsche to recognize that the death of God doesn't eliminate the possibility of meaning, but transforms it from something received to something created. God's death doesn't lead to meaninglessness, but to the recognition that meaning has always been human creation. What dies is not meaning itself, but the illusion that meaning exists independently of human valuation. But this insight raises the crucial question. If meaning is human creation rather than divine revelation, what distinguishes meaningful creation from arbitrary preference? If no perspective has divine authorization, what makes some perspectives better than others? And most importantly, if humans must create meaning in the void left by God's death, what guides this creation? As Nietzsche continued his investigation, a consistent pattern emerged across diverse responses to God's death throughout history. Despite their apparent differences, all successful responses share a common structure. They transform the void from a negative absence to a positive space of possibility. This pattern became clear to Nietzsche as he compared different cultural responses to divine absence. In his comparative studies of ancient Greek culture and Christianity, he noted how Greeks like Heraclitus embraced cosmic meaninglessness not as nihilistic despair, but as the necessary condition for human meaning-making. The Greek tragic worldview didn't deny suffering or meaninglessness, but incorporated them into a life-affirming aesthetic perspective. Nietzsche contrasted this with Christianity's response to divine absence, the crucifixion narrative where God withdraws, prompting Christ's cry, my, why have you forsaken me?" Christianity interpreted this void as temporary abandonment that would be resolved through resurrection and eventual return. The void wasn't embraced but overcome, not transformed, but eliminated. This comparison revealed something crucial. The void itself isn't the problem. Our relationship to it is. Those who experience divine absence as pure negation fall into nihilism. Those who experience it as a space of possibility become creators. The void doesn't change, but our orientation toward it does. Nietzsche found this pattern replicated across different philosophical traditions. Eastern approaches like Buddhism and Taoism explicitly embrace emptiness, shunyata, or non-being, wu, as generative rather than negative states. The Taoist concept of the useful empty space in a cup or room parallels what Nietzsche was discovering about the productive potential of God's absence. This insight helped Nietzsche understand why identical external circumstances produce such different responses in different individuals. Some encounter divine absence and fall into despair. Others encounter it and experience liberation. The difference isn't in the absence itself, but in the psychological resources brought to that encounter. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche illustrates this through his famous concept of the three metamorphoses of the spirit. The spirit first becomes a camel, dutifully carrying the weight of existing values. Then it transforms into a lion, saying no to imposed values and creating freedom from them. Finally, it becomes a child, innocently creating new values without resentment toward the old or anxiety about divine approval. This developmental sequence doesn't reject the importance of existing values, the camel stage, but recognizes they must be overcome for genuine creativity to emerge. The lion's no creates the void that the child's creativity requires. Without this void, this death of God, and the values God guaranteed, the creative innocence of the child cannot emerge. Nietzsche observed this pattern in artists who successfully navigate divine absence. In his analysis of Greek tragedy, particularly in The Birth of Tragedy, he noted how the greatest artists incorporate awareness of cosmic meaninglessness into their work without falling into despair. They create beauty, not despite the void, but because of it, using the absence of inherent meaning as the space where human meaning creation becomes possible. This artistic response became Nietzsche's model for philosophical engagement with God's death. Rather than trying to refute or replace religion with rational arguments or scientific facts, Nietzsche adopted an aesthetic approach. In The Gay Science, he advocates giving style to one's character, approaching one's life as an artistic creation rather than a moral performance evaluated by divine standards. This aesthetic orientation transforms how we understand truth itself. If God no longer guarantees cosmic truth with a capital T, then truth becomes what Nietzsche called perspectival, always partial, always positioned, always created rather than discovered. This doesn't mean arbitrary relativism where any perspective is as good as any other. Some perspectives enhance life and creativity. Others diminish them. The standard isn't correspondence to divine reality, but contribution to human flourishing. Nietzsche's concept of the will to power emerges from this pattern. Often misunderstood as mere domination over others, will to power actually refers to creative self-overcoming, the capacity to transform limitations into possibilities, to create meaning in the face of meaninglessness, to affirm life despite its suffering. The will to power isn't about controlling reality, but about participating creatively in its becoming. This pattern of creative response to divine absence reveals what Nietzsche called amor fati, love of fate, the capacity to affirm reality exactly as it is, without requiring cosmic purpose or divine justification. In Ecce Homo, he wrote, "My formula for greatness in a human being is amor fati, that one wants nothing to be different, not forward, not backward, not in all eternity, not merely bear what is necessary, still less conceal it. All idealism is mendaciousness in the face of what is necessary, but love it. This love of necessity doesn't mean passive acceptance, but creative engagement. Not resignation to what is, but transformation of how we relate to what is. The void left by God's death isn't filled, but transformed from meaningless empty space to the necessary clearing where human creativity becomes possible." But this pattern raises a profound question. If the creative response to God's death requires this radical transformation in how we relate to meaning, purpose, and truth, why is this response so rare? What prevents most people from making this transition from nihilism to creativity? And most importantly, how might this transformation become more accessible to those living in the shadow of God's death? The implications of Nietzsche's investigation extend far beyond academic philosophy. If God's death creates the void where authentic human creativity becomes possible, everything changes. Our understanding of meaning, our approach to morality, our relationship to suffering, and most fundamentally, our sense of what constitutes a well-lived human life. First, consider how this insight transforms our understanding of meaning. In traditional frameworks, meaning flows from top to bottom, from divine plan to human purpose. But if God is dead, meaning must be generated from the ground up, from human valuation rather than cosmic revelation. This doesn't make meaning less real, but changes its nature from something discovered to something created. Nietzsche explored this transformation in The Gay Science through his concept of the eternal recurrence, a thought experiment asking whether you would choose to live your exact life with all its pain and joy infinitely many times. This isn't about literal cosmic repetition, but about a relationship to existence that says yes to life exactly as it is, without requiring it to conform to pre-existing meaning structures. This approach doesn't abolish meaning, but transforms it. Instead of asking, "What is the meaning of life?" a question that presumes meaning exists independently of human valuation, we ask, "What meaning will I create in my life?" This shift doesn't diminish meaning, but intensifies it by making us responsible for its creation rather than passive recipients of cosmic purpose. In personal terms, this means approaching your life not as the fulfillment of a pre-existing plan, but as an artistic creation that expresses your unique valuation. Your choices don't align with or deviate from cosmic purpose. They constitute purpose through the values they embody. The question isn't whether you're fulfilling your purpose, but whether you're creating a life that expresses what you find most valuable. Socially, Nietzsche's insight challenges how moral frameworks function. If morality isn't grounded in divine command but human creation, Moral claims can't appeal to absolute authority. Instead, they must honestly acknowledge the values they express and the kind of life they promote. This doesn't make morality arbitrary, but connects it directly to human flourishing rather than divine approval. Consider how this plays out in contemporary ethical debates. When opposing sides claim moral truth for their positions, conversation stalls because each assumes access to absolute standards. A Nietzschean approach would ask not, which position is objectively right, but what values do these positions express, and what kind of human life do they promote? This shifts from abstract moral argument to concrete evaluation of lived consequences. Institutionally, Nietzsche's analysis reveals how social structures often preserve divine authority in secular disguise. Educational systems present knowledge as absolute rather than perspectival. Legal systems ground justice in universal principles rather than evolving human values. Political systems justify power through appeals to natural rights or historical necessity rather than acknowledging their foundations in human valuation. All these approaches maintain the structure of divine authority while changing its content. But the most profound implication concerns our relationship to suffering. Traditional frameworks interpret suffering as punishment, test, or opportunity for spiritual growth, giving it cosmic meaning that justifies its existence. Without God, suffering has no inherent meaning or purpose. It simply is. This recognition doesn't minimize suffering's reality, but transforms how we relate to it, not as something that must have meaning, but as a condition of existence that we incorporate into our creative self-overcoming. Nietzsche experienced this transformation in his own relationship to physical pain. Rather than interpreting his suffering as divine punishment or spiritual test, he came to see it as simply part of his life's material, neither justified nor condemned, but incorporated into his self-creation. His chronic health problems became not obstacles to his work, but conditions that shaped its unique perspective. In Twilight of the Idols, Nietzsche famously wrote, "From life's school of war, what does not kill me makes me stronger." This isn't simplistic optimism, but recognition that suffering, when neither denied nor given false meaning, can be transformed through creative response. The void left by God's death doesn't eliminate suffering but liberates us from the need to justify it cosmically. This approach to suffering exemplifies what Nietzsche called the transvaluation of all values, not rejecting values entirely, but transforming their foundation from divine command to human creation. Values don't disappear when God dies. They change from absolutes to expressions, from discoveries to creations, from universal truths to particular perspectives that enhance or diminish life. For Nietzsche, this transvaluation was humanity's greatest challenge and opportunity following God's death. In The Will to Power, he wrote, "What I relate is the history of the next 2 centuries. For when truth engages in a struggle with the lies of millennia, we shall have upheavals, a convulsion of earthquakes, a moving of mountains and valleys, the like of which has never been dreamed of. There will be wars the like of which have never yet been seen on earth." This apocalyptic language wasn't predicting literal wars, though the 20th century's ideological conflicts might validate such a reading, but describing the psychological and cultural upheaval that accompanies fundamental value transformation. The death of God doesn't occur once and for all, but unfolds across generations as its implications gradually penetrate human consciousness. This gradual unfolding explains why many still live as if God were alive, even while intellectually accepting his death. The psychological structures shaped by divine authority persist long after explicit belief fades. Moving beyond these structures requires not just intellectual recognition of God's death, but existential confrontation with its implications, facing the void not just as concept, but as lived reality. But if this transformation is so demanding, so psychologically challenging, why undertake it at all? What makes the creative response to God's death worth the existential vertigo it requires? The answer lies in Nietzsche's vision of what becomes possible when humans fully embrace their role not as creatures fulfilling divine purpose, but as creators of meaning in an open universe. The most profound conspiracy Nietzsche uncovered isn't that religious authorities deliberately invented God to control populations. It's something far more pervasive and subtle, a collective agreement to forget that we created God in the first place. This conspiracy of forgetting serves everyone, both those who use divine authority for control and those who find comfort in cosmic certainty. This collective amnesia isn't maintained through explicit deception, but through language itself. Notice how we speak about meaning and value, discovering your purpose rather than creating your purpose, finding meaning rather than making meaning. Our very grammar implies meaning exists independently of human valuation, waiting to be found rather than waiting to be made. Nietzsche explores this linguistic conspiracy in his essay, On Truth and Lies in a Non-Moral Sense, 1873, where he examines how language creates the illusion of fixed categories in a world of constant flux. Words don't just describe reality but construct it, creating the impression that concepts like God, purpose, and meaning correspond to eternal entities rather than human perspectives. Educational institutions perpetuate this forgetting by teaching values as discoveries rather than creations. From childhood, we're taught to ask, what is the right thing to do, rather than, what values do I want to express through my actions? This framing presents meaning as something we find rather than something we make, hiding our role in value creation. Religious institutions have obvious reasons to maintain this conspiracy. If God is recognized as human creation rather than cosmic entity, religious authority is fundamentally transformed. This explains why Nietzsche's work faced such fierce resistance from religious quarters, not because it promoted immorality, but because it revealed the human origins of supposedly divine values. But the conspiracy extends to secular institutions as well. Political systems don't present laws as expressions of particular values, but as implementations of justice. Scientific communities don't frame knowledge as perspectival, but as objective truth. Economic systems don't acknowledge values embedded in market structures, but present them as natural laws. All these approaches preserve the structure of divine authority while changing its content. Perhaps most telling is how philosophy itself has participated in this conspiracy. Even after the Enlightenment challenged religious authority, philosophers sought new foundations for absolute values, whether in universal reason, Kant, material conditions, Marx, or utility calculations, Bentham and Mill. These approaches replaced God with other guarantors of meaning, maintaining the basic framework of absolute values while changing their source. Nietzsche called this persistent pattern the shadow of God. In The Gay Science, he writes, God is dead, but given the way of men, there may still be caves for thousands of years in which his shadow will be shown. This shadow isn't just explicit religious belief, but the entire structure of thinking that requires absolute meaning, objective purpose, and universal values. But why is this conspiracy so persistent? Why do even those who intellectually accept God's death continue to live as if absolute meaning existed? Nietzsche found the answer in human psychology, specifically in our fear of responsibility. It's easier to follow established values than to create your own. The person who recognizes God as human creation must accept the tremendous burden of determining their own values without external validation. In Beyond Good and Evil, Nietzsche writes that people would rather will nothingness than not will at all, meaning people would rather follow destructive values than face the responsibility of creating their own. This insight explains why even oppressive value systems often find willing participants among the oppressed. The certainty of imposed meaning is less terrifying than the freedom of self-creation. Consider how this conspiracy functions in contemporary society. Self-help culture promises to help you find your purpose rather than create it. Political movements frame their goals not as expressions of particular values, but as moral imperatives. Scientific discourse presents findings not as positioned perspectives, but as objective truths. This value framing isn't accidental. It places certain questions beyond debate by making them matters of discovery rather than creation. Nietzsche wasn't suggesting we could simply opt out of this conspiracy. It's embedded in our language, institutions, and psychology. Even attempting to live beyond the shadow of God requires tremendous effort. This is why Nietzsche described his ideal reader as rare. Few people can bear the responsibility of creating values rather than inheriting them. The conspiracy's most effective aspect is its treatment of those who expose it. Throughout history, Those who questioned divine authority weren't engaged with intellectually but condemned as immoral. This creates a perfect defense mechanism. The system uses itself to protect itself. Even suggesting God is human creation becomes classified as blasphemy within the system being questioned. Nietzsche experienced this firsthand. During his lifetime, his works were either ignored or characterized as promoting nihilism and immorality, rather than analyzing the human creation of values. After his mental collapse in 1889, his sister Elisabeth Förster Nietzsche gained control of his unpublished writings and deliberately misinterpreted them to align with her own nationalist and anti-Semitic views, precisely the kind of absolute value system Nietzsche criticized. This misrepresentation reveals the final aspect of the conspiracy, the co-option of critics. Those who expose the human origins of values are either condemned or, more insidiously, reinterpreted to seem like they're proposing just another absolute value system rather than a fundamental reconsideration of value creation itself. The most sophisticated version of this co-option appears in existentialist interpretations of Nietzsche that frame his work as advocating subjective meaning creation while preserving the structure of meaning as something to be found rather than made. These interpretations maintain the basic paradigm of meaning as discovery, while changing its location from external cosmos to internal psyche. But if this conspiracy is so pervasive, so embedded in our thinking and institutions, why did it develop in the first place? What function does it serve? And most importantly, what becomes possible when we recognize God not as cosmic entity, but as humanity's greatest artwork? The truth Nietzsche uncovered about God's death has been systematically obscured not through malicious conspiracy, but through institutional self-preservation and psychological necessity. Understanding why this knowledge has been covered up reveals its revolutionary potential. First, religious institutions have obvious reasons to suppress the idea that God is human creation, rather than cosmic entity. If God is revealed as humanity's most significant artwork, rather than its creator, religious authority fundamentally changes. Religious leaders become interpreters of human cultural expression, rather than representatives of divine will. While some liberal theological traditions might accommodate this view, traditional religious institutions cannot without transforming their core identity. Nietzsche observed this dynamic during his lifetime in 19th-century Germany. As historical criticism revealed the human origins and development of religious texts, religious authorities responded not by incorporating these insights, but by condemning the research as blasphemous. The need to maintain divine authority outweighed commitment to understanding religion as human cultural creation. Political institutions similarly depend on absolute values. Governments don't present laws as expressions of particular perspectives, but as implementations of justice. Nations don't describe wars as pursuing interests, but as defending good against evil. The moral framing transforms contingent political decisions into necessary actions, removing them from the realm of debate. Even revolutionary movements that challenge existing power structures typically don't question value absolutism itself. They simply invert it, claiming those previously considered virtuous are actually evil and vice versa. This preserves the basic structure of absolute values while changing their content. True revolutionary thinking would question this structure itself, which is why genuine value innovators are rare compared to mere value inverters. Educational institutions also perpetuate this covering up by teaching ethics as the study of what we should do rather than how values function psychologically and culturally. Philosophy departments discuss which moral theory is correct rather than examining morality as human creation. This approach presents values as something we discover rather than create, hiding our role in value formation. But institutional motives are only half the explanation. The deeper reason this knowledge remains covered up lies in human psychology. Simply put, most people don't want to know. Recognizing God's death places enormous responsibility on each person to create meaning rather than receive it. Few are willing to bear this responsibility. Nietzsche explores this psychological resistance in Thus Spoke Zarathustra through the concept of the last man, someone who avoids responsibility by seeking comfort and security above all else. The last man doesn't want freedom but consensus, not creation but consumption. This psychological type doesn't want to move beyond God's shadow, but prefers the comfort of borrowed values, even if these values ultimately diminish rather than enhance life. In his personal life, Nietzsche experienced this resistance firsthand. His works received little attention during his lifetime, not just because they were difficult, but because they were threatening. His closest friends, including Paul Rée and Lou Salomé, ultimately distanced themselves from his more radical ideas. Even those who admired Nietzsche's intellect often found his questioning of absolute values too destabilizing to fully embrace. The most profound reason Nietzsche's insights remain covered up is their implications for human identity. Traditional frameworks don't just tell us what to do, they tell us who we are. They create stable identities: the believer, the rationalist, the good person, the productive citizen. These identities provide psychological security even when they're limiting. It's often more comforting to think of oneself as fulfilling a pre-existing role than as creating oneself without blueprint or guarantee. Recognizing God's death dissolves these fixed identities. The person living in the void doesn't have a stable identity, but exists in a constant state of becoming. As Nietzsche writes in The Gay Science, they must become who they are, not by discovering a hidden essence, but by creating themselves through their choices. This prospect is exhilarating but also terrifying, which explains why many prefer the shadow of God to the full implications of his death. This explains why Nietzsche's ideas have been systematically misinterpreted. His concept of the Übermensch was distorted into a superior person, rather than one who continuously overcomes themselves. His critique of morality was characterized as promoting immorality, rather than examining the human creation of values. His vision of life beyond good and evil was portrayed as embracing evil, rather than transcending the dichotomy entirely. These misinterpretations weren't accidents, but psychological necessities for those encountering ideas that threatened their fundamental sense of self. It's easier to dismiss Nietzsche as dangerous than to engage with his actual challenge, creating values consciously rather than inheriting them unconsciously. In our contemporary world, we see this same pattern of misinterpretation and dismissal. Those questioning absolute values aren't engaged with intellectually, but condemned morally. This creates a perfect defense mechanism. The system defends itself by using its own standards to dismiss challenges to those standards. What's most revealing is how Nietzsche himself has been treated by subsequent philosophical traditions. Academic philosophy has largely domesticated his thinking, treating him as one philosopher among many, rather than someone questioning the very foundation of value formation. His insights are discussed as interesting perspectives, rather than fundamental challenges to how we understand meaning creation. Even more telling is how popular culture has misappropriated Nietzsche. His statement that God is dead has been treated as simple atheism, rather than a profound diagnosis of cultural transformation. His concept of the will to power has been reduced to mere dominance rather than creative self-overcoming. His vision of life beyond good and evil has been characterized as mere amorality rather than a more demanding ethical stance. Perhaps the most sophisticated cover-up comes from existentialist interpretations that acknowledge God's death while preserving the structure of meaning as something to be found rather than made. These approaches seem to embrace Nietzsche's insight while actually neutralizing its revolutionary potential. They replace cosmic meaning with personal meaning while maintaining the basic paradigm of meaning as discovery rather than creation. What all these responses share is avoidance of Nietzsche's central challenge. If God is dead, meaning can't be discovered, but must be created. This creative responsibility places tremendous demands on each individual, demands many would rather avoid through deference to tradition, consensus, or authority. This avoidance isn't weakness, but a natural psychological response to a genuinely terrifying prospect. Creating meaning in the void requires tremendous internal strength. It means living without the comfort of cosmic validation, without the security of fixed identity, and without the reassurance that we're fulfilling pre-existing purpose. Nietzsche himself recognized how difficult this path was. In his later works, particularly Ecce Homo, written in 1888, just before his mental collapse, he reflected on his own struggle to live according to his insights. Even for him, arguably the most penetrating psychological thinker of his era, maintaining this perspective required constant effort against internal and external resistance. This is why knowledge of God's death has been covered up not just by institutions but by individuals, not through conscious deception but through psychological necessity. We hide this knowledge from ourselves because facing it would transform our relationship to everything, our past actions, our social roles, our deepest sense of who we are. But if this knowledge is so destabilizing, so difficult to integrate, why should we confront it at all? What becomes possible when we recognize that God is dead and we must become creators ourselves? This brings us to the final and most important question. What lies beyond the shadow of God? The final question isn't whether God is dead. The evidence Nietzsche uncovered leaves little doubt that divine authority can no longer function as the foundation of meaning and value in our cultural context. The real question is, what will you do in the void this death creates? What becomes possible when you recognize your role not as a creature fulfilling cosmic purpose, but as a creator of meaning in an open universe? This recognition doesn't lead to nihilism or despair, but to what Nietzsche called the revaluation of all values. It's not about abandoning meaning, but transforming your relationship to it, from passive recipient to active creator. The person living beyond God's shadow doesn't experience life as meaningless, but as overflowing with potential meanings awaiting creative expression. This approach transforms how you relate to yourself. Rather than dividing yourself into the parts that align with divine purpose and the parts that don't, you can experience yourself as an integrated whole, neither justified nor condemned by cosmic authority, but simply expressing your unique valuation through your choices and creations. Nietzsche describes this integration in Twilight of the Idols as becoming what one is. This doesn't mean discovering a hidden authentic self, but creating yourself through the values you express. The question shifts from, am I fulfilling my purpose, to, what values am I embodying through my choices? This approach doesn't diminish responsibility, but intensifies it by making you the author rather than merely the actor in your life's narrative. This perspective transforms how you relate to others as well. When you recognize all values as human creations, rather than cosmic commandments, you become less concerned with judging others against absolute standards and more interested in understanding the values their lives express. Moral disagreement becomes a conversation about different ways of valuing rather than a battle between good and evil. In your relationships, imagine the difference between asking, "Is this the right thing to do?" and asking, "What values does this choice express?" The first question assumes a pre-existing answer. The second acknowledges your role in creating values through your actions. This approach doesn't eliminate ethical consideration, but grounds it in honest acknowledgement of your role in value creation. Most importantly, this recognition transforms how you engage with society. The person living beyond God's shadow doesn't passively accept inherited values, but asks what these values do and whom they serve. They become capable of what Nietzsche called philosophizing with a hammer, testing inherited values to see which enhance life and which diminish it. This critical stance doesn't mean rejecting all traditions. Nietzsche wasn't calling for destruction of inherited values, but for conscious engagement with them, recognizing them as human creations to be evaluated rather than divine commands to be obeyed. Some traditional values may well serve life when freely chosen rather than blindly followed. Others may need transformation or abandonment. What might this look like in practice? Instead of asking whether your life aligns with cosmic purpose, you might ask, does this path express what I find most valuable? Does it emerge from fear or creativity? Does it affirm life with its inevitable suffering and joy? Or does it seek escape from life's fundamental nature? This approach doesn't make life easier. It makes it more demanding. Living beyond God's shadow requires constant consciousness of your role in value creation. There's no external authority to validate your choices, no cosmic guarantee that you're on the right path. This responsibility can be terrifying, which is why many prefer the comfort of borrowed values despite their limitations. But with this responsibility comes unprecedented freedom. Not freedom from consequences, but freedom to create meaning rather than merely consume it. This is what Nietzsche meant by becoming philosophers of the future and free spirits. Not people without values, but people who create values with full awareness of what they're doing. If you've stayed with me through this investigation, you're already showing the intellectual courage this perspective requires. You're willing to question what most take for granted, to look beneath the surface of our most fundamental assumptions about meaning and purpose. This willingness to question is the first step toward creating values consciously, rather than inheriting them unconsciously. I invite you to continue this journey by examining your own relationship to meaning. The next time you find yourself asking, "What should I do?" or "What is my purpose?" pause and reframe the question. What values do I want to express through this choice? This slight shift doesn't diminish the importance of your decision, but acknowledges your role in creating its meaning. This kind of philosophical self-examination isn't just academic. It's transformative. It changes how you experience yourself and the world. It doesn't make life simpler, but it makes it more authentic. It doesn't provide cosmic certainty, but it opens possibilities that remain closed when we live in the shadow of dead certainties. If this perspective resonates with you, I invite you to join our philosophical community by subscribing to this channel and activating notifications for future investigations. Each video explores different aspects of how we might live beyond inherited frameworks and create meaning consciously. Your comments and reflections enrich this ongoing conversation about what becomes possible when we recognize God's death not as a tragedy, but as the necessary condition for human creative freedom. I'm particularly interested in hearing about moments when you've experienced the void, not as emptiness, but as possibility. When have you felt the exhilarating freedom of creating meaning rather than receiving it? What opened up when you moved beyond the shadow of God in your own life? Share your experience in the comments, and let's continue this investigation together. Remember, the death of God isn't the end of meaning, but the beginning of conscious meaning creation. As Nietzsche wrote, the Creator seeks companions, not corpses or herds or believers. The greatest tribute to Nietzsche isn't to agree with his conclusions, but to engage in the same radical questioning and creative affirmation he modeled. Thank you for joining me in this investigation. Until next time, keep questioning, keep creating, and keep becoming who you are in the open possibility that God's death creates.